I totally sympathize with what you're saying. I think it's an enormous problem. We've got to get around this as a country, and especially as communities, where you have communities where basically people don't even speak the same language politically, don't understand each other's terms of reference, and we're all locked into seeing our set of websites and have no idea what's and now Google and all of the internet sites have ways of tracking what your politics are, so that they will give you more of the same, and link you to other people who. So it's like we're all in these echo chambers. We've got to get out of the silos and echo chambers and start talking to each other as neighbors. And this is one of the things that I advocate wherever I go. Talk to your neighbors and share stuff with them. Grow garden veggies, keep chickens, give your extra chicken eggs to your neighbors across the fence. Get to know them, regardless of their politics, because we are all in this together, regardless of our beliefs. Yes? It's interesting, the former managing director of J.P. Morgan that I spoke with, his name is John Fullerton. He's since developed something called the Capital Institute. And the purpose of the Capital Institute is to find ways of making capital available to environmental projects. One of the hedge fund managers I spoke with, a guy named Nate Hagens, has gone on to get his PhD in ecological economics from the Gund Institute. And now he's working on, I guess you could say, for the other side. So, there are, I think, a lot of things that folks with that kind of understanding of the financial industry can do that can be very, very helpful. Because very often the folks who have been working on environmental and social issues for a long time don't really have much understanding of the financial industry and how it works and how money works. And it's really helpful to have some of those folks on our side, if you will. Not just shaking trees and making money appear, but also helping us to understand how these social systems operate. It's a very helpful contribution, and he's actually writing as a contributor to a school of thought which is called ecological economics, and there are a number of other authors who've contributed to that body of literature. Herman Daly is someone who really deserves to be named here, because for the last 30 years he's been writing about what he calls the steady state economy. He was one of the first economists, and he is a respected economist. He was a principal economist at the World Bank for a few years before that became just too uncomfortable. But Herman Daly has written an ecological economics textbook that's used widely in courses on the subject, and so there is a body of thought out there. It's not sufficient yet. It's pointing the way toward what could be a functioning post-growth economy, but a lot still needs to be fleshed out, and the tricky part is going to be the transition from what we have now to something else. Well, the communications revolution is significant, of course. What it's done is to speed up the industrial machine and rationalize it, make it more efficient. We're not eating computer chips. We're not driving. Yes, we have computer chips in our cars that help make them more efficient and so on, but we're still putting gasoline in the tank. The basic movers of our economy are still the same fundamental industrial machines that we have been using for decades. Most of the electricity in this country is still coming from coal and natural gas-fired power plants. The vast majority of vehicles on the road are still being moved by refined oil, and so on. Because these little devices are so seductive, it's tempting to think that, that is the basis for a whole new economy. And it can be the basis for the generation of wealth. But when we speak of an economy, we have to understand what's making it run at the most basic levels. And from that standpoint, not a lot has changed. There are movements to replace GDP, especially at the local level and state level. And I think this is something Vermont could do, and I know there's already discussion about this. The first step, of course, is to identify an alternative index and then to use it in parallel with GDP and then to phase out GDP. There's been a lot of work on this. Again, Herman Daly has done some of that work on what came to be known as the genuine progress indicator. He did some of the earlier work that was then developed further by an organization called Reinventing Progress. And the GPI is a much more robust indicator. It takes into account environmental factors, social factors, and so on. There's another one which is also gaining ground, which is called gross national happiness. And that was developed in the tiny kingdom of Bhutan, starting in the early 1970s. And Bhutan, at that time, was seeing globalization at its door. And the king of Bhutan used this phrase, gross national happiness, in a speech, and it immediately caught on and took root, and they started looking for indicators, how you could survey people to see how happy they are. And so they have used that as a guide ever since. And Bhutan has a very low GDP to this day, but the Bhutanese people are some of the happiest people in the world. So go figure. I guess we have to choose what we want and what we want to aim for. For planners, a number of things. First, scenarios are helpful, I think, and using realistic scenarios. When I talk to planners, very often I find that they're using a range of scenarios that, from this perspective, would be all unrealistically optimistic in terms of energy costs, energy supply levels, and rates of economic activity. In other words, everyone's assuming, the worst case scenario is slow growth. That's the worst case scenario, and then we go up from there. So I think it's important to have some true worst case scenarios and then have emergency plans that take those into account. I think emergency planning is really important at this stage of the game at all levels for transport, for food systems, for power, electrical power, because we are going to be seeing more and more disruptions, whether they're social and economic in nature or climate impacts, weather events. We have to understand that business as usual is largely a thing of the past, and we have to think now of business as unusual. Yeah, well, I think that's a very good book. In my humble opinion, an even better book is one by an archaeologist named Joseph Tainter, which was published in the late 1980s, 1988, I think, called The Collapse of Complex Societies, or The Collapse of Complex Societies, yeah. It's considered this sort of standard work on the subject in the field of archaeology. And Tainter describes collapse in terms of complexity. Societies use increasing complexity as a way of solving problems and taking advantage of temporary abundances of resources and energy. But then when they reach limits, then they have to simplify in one way or another. And that process of simplification, if it occurs rapidly, we look at it and we call that collapse. Well, we're in a situation where we are going to have to simplify. And whether that looks like collapse, I think really depends on how how we engage in that process. I don't think it has to be a chaotic collapse, but we are going to have to reduce the levels of complexity in our society in some substantial ways. And we have time to do that. It doesn't need to happen all at once. And when I say complexity, I mean complexity, for example, in the financial sector. We have created a financial sector that is far too large and complex for what it does for us. And it needs to be broken down and simplified. And we could probably say the same thing about other aspects of our society. We are going to be less mobile in the future, and that means we are going to be more locally based, community-based. So that if that happens all at once in a chaotic, destructive fashion, then no one's going to be very happy, and I think that would deserve the title collapse. Yeah, that's our natural response to a crisis, is to create more complexity as a way of solving the problem. But in this instance, it's not going to work. The situation you're describing, the one with the $80 to $100 oil price band, is an inherently volatile situation because it can't go on for long, because the $80 mark of what it's costing to develop new oil production capacity is rising at an annual rate. It's the rate of increase on the lower part of that band is quite rapid. And our ability to adapt to higher oil prices at the higher side of the band that's moving more slowly. We are adapting. We can probably deal with, say, oil at $90 a barrel for an extended period of time better today than we could have, say 5 or 10 years ago, to a point. But it's a slow pace of adaptation in terms of people buying smaller cars and so on. Whereas the increase in the cost to the oil industry of developing new capacity, that's going much more rapidly. So it's not a stable situation, and that's why I think it's going to inevitably lead to more volatility in oil prices, and it will lead to an increasing shift of demand for oil from U.S. and other industrialized countries to Asia. Well, they are starting to reflect it. I mean, the commodity prices, as I said earlier, have been increasing and are becoming more volatile. You see it most especially with oil prices, and you can watch it on a daily basis. Every day when there's good economic news, the oil price goes up until there's bad economic news and the oil price goes down. But as oil prices go up and stay up, then that drags on the economy until eventually we start seeing bad news on Wall Street, stock prices going down and so on, and then the oil price goes down because oil traders look at the crystal ball and say, oh well, the economy is going to hell, so that means there will be less demand for fuel. So it's really a recipe for, as I said, more volatility as time goes on, and there's no solution within that system. What do we have to hope for? Well, I'm privileged to be able to travel as much as I do, and I've met so many young people over the course of the last 7 to 10 years when I've been doing a lot of traveling, who are seeing and understanding these fundamental forces active in the world, and that they understand that their lives are going to be shaped by these forces, and that they're not going to see the kind of life stretching out ahead of them that they might otherwise expect. And so a lot of these young people are doing things like going into farming. And there are organizations now of young farmers. And I think that's one of the most hopeful things that I know of out there. Young people going into the renewable energy industry. I meet a lot of folks like that. Of course, that's not everyone, and we need to encourage more by making those opportunities available. The saddest thing to me is meeting an idealistic, smart, young person or young couple who want to go into farming and who know how to do it, but they can't afford access to land. So we have to find ways of supporting young people in doing the things that actually need to be done for the sake of ourselves and our communities. No, I wouldn't think so. Natural gas it's a funny market right now because, of course, conventional natural gas, both in the US and Canada, is in decline. But what we're seeing is unconventional gas make up the difference and some. And when I say unconventional gas, I mean production from very low porosity rocks, mostly shale, using hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling. Now, this technology has been around for some time, but it's just in the last few years that it's been applied on a broad scale with natural gas. And it's created something of a bubble. Around 2006, 2007, there were very high rates of drilling. Natural gas price, as conventional gas supply was falling off, natural gas prices were getting bid up to the range of $10, $12, even $14 a thousand cubic feet. Very, very high prices for natural gas. And so the unconventional gas drillers took advantage of those high prices, and they were drilling 20, 30,000 wells a year. Very, very high rates of drilling. And as a result, we had a temporary glut that is still working its way through the market. And so people are looking at that glut and saying, oh, well, this unconventional gas is making natural gas cheap and abundant so that it will be cheap and abundant for the foreseeable future. We don't think that's the case. Our analysis suggests that this is a bubble, that rates of drilling, the price of natural gas has fallen now to the $4 and change level, much lower. So at this price point, most of those shale gas producers are not actually making money on production. They're producing in order to keep the investment capital coming in, and they're subsisting on investment capital, which is almost the definition of a bubble. Okay, so as this glut works its way through the system, inevitably prices are going to have to go up, and we're also going to see a shakeout in the industry. So some of the smaller producers are going to go out of business or be bought by the larger producers and so on. So this, over the long run, what we're going to see is conventional natural gas declining even faster, because conventional gas discoveries in this country really fell off a cliff a decade or two ago. And unless we're finding the gas, production has to follow discovery at some point. So we're going to see very rapidly declining conventional gas, and unconventional gas is only going to be able to partly make up for that, even with heroic rates of drilling and high prices. So to invest more in gas infrastructure at this point, even though at the moment it looks economic to do so, is actually not a wise thing to do from a long-range perspective. Also, the unconventional gas, several analyses have shown, is from a climate standpoint actually worse than coal, because of all the extraordinary technology that's required to get the gas out of the ground. A lot of the methane is fugitive methane that ends up in the atmosphere. It's 20 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as CO2. So the net result is it's actually worse for the climate than if we were burning coal. So
we can't afford the water.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a kind of narrow window in terms of the federal budget. We have a fairly narrow window where it may be possible to make one last big investment that involves increase in government debt. But it needs to be targeted specifically at this energy and social transition that we've been talking about. Toward renewable energy, toward building local transport and food infrastructure. because that's what we will be relying on as the century wears on. I think that window will close fairly rapidly because right now it's very cheap for the U.S. to borrow money internationally. One can envision a situation a few years down the road where that may not be true and borrowing may become more expensive. And if we do this simply by turning on the printing presses, as it were, by the Federal Reserve, buying T-bills and in enormous quantities and so on, ultimately that will result in a decline in the value of the currency. So hyperinflation, I would say, is not something we have to worry about immediately, but we can't just print our way out of the problem because ultimately that does result in a currency collapse. We do need fundamental monetary reform. As long as money is tied to debt, then the problem of where the interest will come from becomes a serious problem. And we have a financial system where the expectation is, you invest and you can anticipate if you invest intelligently, and if you're a large-scale investor, you anticipate making 5, 10, even more % per year. In a non-growing economy, that's not very realistic. So that's one of the factors that's going to require, I think, a general shrinkage of the financial industry. Then currency itself, are there models for non-debt-based currency? Yes, there are. Direct credit clearing systems of all kinds have been pioneered in different places in the world. There are lots of community currencies that are actively being used around this country and elsewhere, usually on a pretty small scale, because since people can't pay their mortgages and taxes with them, they tend to use them only for fairly ephemeral purchases and hires and so on. But as the national currency becomes more problematic, and I think it will as time goes on, then having a local currency in operation, I think, will be a very important kind of backstop to maintain local economic activity. So even if it's hard to get them started and hard to keep them going, I'm a very big advocate of local currencies. The problem of national currencies and replacing national currencies, it's a big subject. I would recommend a book or the work of Thomas Greco, who is a monetary theorist who's worked on the subject a great deal. There are others worth mentioning also, and I talk about them in my book. I think there will be forms of carbon sequestration, perhaps in some cases biochar may be a good form of carbon sequestration. Reforestation, I think, is going to be a very good form of carbon capture. I'm not so excited about what's being called clean coal. And the reason for that is that actually, my previous book was called Blackout: Coal Climate and the Last Energy Crisis. Goes into this in considerable detail. There are good reasons for thinking that the international price of coal is set to go much higher as a result of high demand levels in China. And when that happens, the economics of carbon capture and storage for coal are just not going to be able to be worked out. CCS electricity from coal, it would be expensive anyway. And then if you add higher coal prices, then almost any other source of electricity is cheaper by comparison. Certainly wind would be cheaper in almost every instance. Well, unfortunately, it's going to make it harder. I mean, now, if you have a natural disaster, the helicopters fly in bottled water or medicines or whatever you need. I think we're looking at a future where it's going to become more and more difficult for that to happen. So that's another reason why we need to really develop more local resilience. And when I say resilience, I mean more local inventories and more redundancy of systems, because that's what makes a community resilient. You know, if a community is more dependent on outside resources than it tends to be, it may be more economically efficient. You know, if we can grow all of our corn in Iowa and nothing in Iowa but corn, that may be economically efficient, but if the corn crop in Iowa fails, then nobody has corn. Well, that principle is true throughout the economy. We have traded resilience for economic efficiency for decades, and we've become very lopsided. We need to move back in the direction of resilience, which means, as I said, more local redundancy and inventories of all kinds of things. So that has a lot of implications for disaster management that are probably too detailed to talk about here, but those are the general principles. Okay, thank you all very much.
I just want to leave you with a few positive thoughts, because, you know, this is a pretty heavy topic, right? But if you think about the state of Vermont, we bring some unique strengths to the table. I mean, the fact that we've got town meeting means that our neighbors do already talk to each other. The fact that we still have villages and village centers and you know, for you planners, when you think about your communities, bringing this creative relocalization to Vermont, which is really what we're talking about for our future, isn't going to be so hard. We don't have a culture here except in a few small spots of recreational shopping, and that's because there's nowhere to shop in a lot of our state, right? So think about that racetrack. I don't know if you ever watch the races, but sometimes when you watch the races, you see one car that's so old and slow and so far behind that it ends up looking like it's leading the pack. Right, that's Vermont. So I think we're at a tremendous advantage, and it's so great to see so many planners here, because as you think about your community's future, keeping in mind some of these principles of redundancy and how we build our communities so that we really serve ourselves, serve our neighboring communities, that really is the strength of the future. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for being here.